I'm going to tempt Adam with one fruit, let's say pears, but I'm not sure what I'm going to tempt Eve with. But I'm settling it that I'm going to tempt Adam with pears. Oh, Adam sins. Okay, well, I don't want pears to be ruined for Eve, so I'll tempt her with oranges. Now, these free choices happen at the same time. The open theist can't imagine that God does things that way. You know, God has to learn at the same time exactly what each of them is going to do. But Hunt's examples include quite a range of cases, and some of them, I think, are much more problematic. His cases are often of this sort. There's a stage in God's knowledge that doesn't include God's decision to allow a certain free choice to be made by a person at a time, and God sort of peeks ahead of their choice before deciding whether to allow the choice to be made. He supplements that stage of his foreknowledge with information about events posterior to the time of choice. Some instances of this general form do not pose any deep puzzles, and some would give some providential advantages. But I'm going to try to show that some of Hunt's examples are highly problematic. And I believe that when these are taken away, the providential advantages over open theism will be very small, though I won't have time to argue for that. And I'm being sort of unfair to Hunt because I'm not actually using his examples, so I should just say that I think Hunt is a terrific philosopher, and he's taught me a lot about this topic over the years. And, there were much worse versions of this paper before he helped me out. So you better go read his stuff to see whether I'm being fair. Here's an unproblematic case in which God could know that a certain result of a free action would take place without knowing about some of the free actions that caused it. Overdetermination. Suppose the state of the world at t and earlier is known at stage S1, but it is not settled by what is included in that stage whether Jones will be put in circumstances in which he can freely choose to sabotage a particular bridge. Let P be the proposition that the bridge collapses. If, given the facts known in S1 by God, it's inevitable that the bridge will collapse, either by Jones' sabotage or if not by some other means, then P is bound to be true later on for one reason or another. As it turns out, God decides to allow Jones to make the decision, and the bridge collapses because of Jones' actions. God knew P that the bridge would collapse at stage S1, though he did not yet know that Jones would decide at T to sabotage the bridge, even though the actual explanation for P's truth involves Jones's decision. I don't see anything terribly paradoxical about this sort of case. But an open theist could say, could suppose that God has similar kinds of knowledge. What about the cases in which at S1 the propositions that are part of S1 do not settle whether P will be true? In that case, choosing whether to know, in that case, without further decisions on God's part, decisions that settle whether P is true, choosing whether to know P at the stage after S1 is itself a sort of divine choice. Now, suppose P isn't yet settled by what God has chosen and what others have done in stages prior to S1. Suppose further that God chooses to know whether P is true without also choosing that P shall be true. And God acquires the information that P is true. And that produces the next stage in God's foreknowledge. In that case, P is never chosen by God. Or if it can still be said to be chosen, God cannot fully explain why he chose it. And if some other proposition Q is not yet part of S1, but is entailed by P and not entailed by anything else God chooses immediately after S1, then Q is in the same boat. So the following principle seems to me to govern the acquisition of foreknowledge by sort of asking for it, by God's sort of querying the future in a deliberate sort of way. P3. If P, some proposition, is not part of S, and S is immediately prior to God's decision to find out whether P is true, and every stage later than S includes P, then either God chooses to make P true, but cannot explain why, or God allows something or someone else to make P true. Some libertarian believers in simple foreknowledge will think it's just fine for there to be propositions that satisfy this schema for P, because God has indeed left it up to us what to do in many circumstances. Namely, all the ones in which we are morally responsible, in the primary sense of moral responsible action. Few theists will allow that the first disjunct of the consequent could be satisfied, though. God just does things impulsively. Now, Hunt's examples often involve God selecting bits of what will happen after some free choice is allowed, but not a whole lot, because if God learns too much, choices will be sort of taken from his hands, so to speak. So there are stages where God can use some, but not too much knowledge about what happens after some creature has a free choice before them. And God has a choice about which bits of foreknowledge he can have. So God's choosing, in these kinds of circumstances then, God's choosing to know whether P is true can't be a matter of his surveying all the things he knows, in other words, everything, and picking the relevant bit. It must be something like choosing to query the future with respect to one sort of fact, but not others. Skipping ahead a bit, a paragraph down. But there are limits to this sort of peeking ahead, and I want to explore these with the aid of these two beautiful diagrams that you have, the big branching diagrams. The trees represent the history of the world up to a certain point, together with every possible history that might have come about after that point. Each node is an indeterministic fork, at which some agent or agents are responsible for the branch that is taken. The disappearance of branches in the move from what is known at stage S1 to what is known at stage S2, from the top to the bottom, the disappearance of those branches represents the addition of knowledge about what actually will or would happen at later stages. Suppose S1 does not include, this first stage, doesn't include Eve's sinning, nor her refraining. In other words, on some of the remaining forks she does, and on others she doesn't. Though it does include God's creating her and Adam. Suppose further that S1 does not include Eve's being tempted by a snake with an apple, because God is still deciding about that. He hasn't decided whether he'll prohibit apples or pears. L, the left fork, is a choice on God's part, would be a choice on God's part to create and prohibit apples. R would be a choice on God's part to create and prohibit pears while encouraging the eating of apples. The nodes immediately after the choice, God's choice between left and right there, represent Eve's temptation by the snake. On the left hand, the snake tempts her with prohibited apples, on the right with prohibited pears. The time T at the top of the diagram is still later, after she will have had opportunity to talk things over with Adam, whether or not she refrained or accepted the fruit. Some of Hunt's stories about providential use of simple foreknowledge seem to involve this following sort of situation. At this stage, God could peek ahead to see whether, at T, Adam will be taking an apple from Eve and eating it, or not. Now let P represent the proposition that Adam is doing so. Adam's taking an apple from Eve and eating it. The truth of P, given the right-hand evolution of the universe, is completely benign, because pears are the prohibited thing. While on the left, P's truth implies that Eve and Adam both sin. Peeking, or querying the future, is an action on God's part immediately subsequent to stage S1, and it results in a new state of knowledge, S2. God's peeking ahead past the time at which Eve actually is tempted leads to the discovery that Adam does accept an apple from Eve at T, and this could certainly be useful knowledge, encouraging God to prohibit pears instead of apples. At least that would leave open the possibility that Eve does not succumb to temptation, although it wouldn't ensure that she doesn't. Note that when God asks, "What will Adam be doing at T?" the answer had better not be a proposition true only on one side of the left-right divide. Suppose the answer were a proposition that is only true on the left side. In that case, creating and prohibiting apples, God's left-hand choice, L, which by hypothesis has not been made yet, it's the choice his querying the future is supposed to help decide. That left-hand side satisfies the conditions in P3. God's next choice has been torn, well, the passage from S1 to the next stage would satisfy the conditions in P3. God's next choice has been torn from his hands. He learned immediately after stage S1 what he, God himself, chose to prohibit before he actually chose it. Perhaps if the answer to a query would rob God of his freedom with respect to a creative act not yet settled, the result of God's choice to ask for this information is something like the answer a magic 8-ball often gives, ask again later. Of course,